launch countdown assignment. This is an exercise where we're going to just print out a countdown from 10 to blast off using JavaScript and loops. So our overview here says we're going to count from 10 to 0, and that we've already been provided with an initializer. So I'm going to open this up in a second screen here, and we can look at the live code and our requirements on the same screen here. So down here we have our live output, and then we have our example code. So they've already provided the let statement of I equals 10. So that means our loop is going to run 10 times. One thing you'll also notice is that this line is commented out. So what tends to happen sometimes, if you're doing live previews of loops and the loop isn't closed or finished, it will run in an infinite loop and you won't be able to do anything more in the browser. So this exercise might be beneficial to start where you have a second browser window open and do your output in console logs before you write your output to the page. So the first thing we're going to want to do is look at the syntax we need to write for a loop. So in the past we've been doing for loops. This exercise we would want to do a while loop. And so the reason I would say that primarily is just how this has been set up. Remember, with a while loop, we have our iterator or initializing value outside of the loop statement. And so the next thing we would do is we'd start our while statement. And so it's going to be our conditions and then our actual code or logic that's going to be performed by this script. So the three components of a loop are pretty much the same, whether we use for loops or while loops or do while. So we have our initializer, we have our looping logic and criteria, and then we also, in this instance, we put the iteration or the incrementer at the end of the loop statement. So in this case, since we're counting down from 10, we're going to say I minus minus, and that will be what causes this loop to de-increment one unit or one value every time it runs. So now that we have the rough structure, if we take a look at the next comments here, it says for every iteration we want to create a new paragraph and append it to the output of a div. So the way this live output works, we don't actually see the div or any of the HTML. So we can translate this instruction by saying we're going to create a constant of output, and we're going to set this equal to document.query selector, and .output will be the class. And again, we don't see this on the page, so we're just kind of going with the flow here. So this is what they're selecting. In the comments, they give us 3 lines of code here. So they give us the element to create the paragraph, they give us the paragraph text, and then they give us the append line of code. So ultimately these 3 lines are going to end up in our logic here. So create a paragraph. That is probably something that we want to have happen at the very beginning of our code. So we want to maybe even put in a comment here, create new paragraph element. And then the next thing we want to do is have the countdown code. So we're going to say, and then the append logic. So the append is this line here. So we're going to say that. And our paragraph text content, we're going to set this equal to something at some point. So I'm just going to move it up to the end. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be in the append logic. So now that we have all of our pieces here, we can start to look at this, and I think we might actually want to move this constant. Actually, no, we've already got it up here. I didn't see that they created that. So we can delete that one. So that constant is there, and so that's selecting the output panel above, and then before the loop starts, it sets the HTML of that to nothing, so an empty string. So now if we take a look over here, it says that different iteration numbers require different text to be put in the paragraph for that iteration. So it says if the number is 10, print countdown 10 to the paragraph. So I'm going to put that in there just as a note. This can be our pseudocode. And it says if the number is 0, then print blast off in the paragraph. So right there, we should be able to deduce or determine that this is our if-else logic here. And we might actually have a if-else. So in order to start on this, what we're going to need to do is put in some logic here that starts that if statement. So notice we're inside the while loop still. And actually we need to set our conditions there. So we didn't go back and do that. So our conditions say loop from 10 down to 0. So while I is greater than or equal to 0, do all of this logic that we're talking about here. So the reason we're doing greater than or equal to is we want it to run up to the point that we get to 0. So it's a little bit opposite of what we've looked at with loops before. So within our if statements now, we want to write this out in actual JavaScript. So we're going to say if, and then our iteration. So the first time we run our loop, we're going to be at 10. So if we can say if this is 10, because if the number is 10 here, we're setting it to strict equality, which means type and value. So it has to be a number 10. Then we want it to do something. So in this instance, we say print countdown 10 to the page. So to print countdown 10 to the paragraph, we will want to use the para content, text content here. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to put that up here. I'm going to comment these out just for our safety sake here of not getting into a loop. And so if we want to print that out, we want to say count down and a space, and then we close our string, and we're going to concatenate in the value. So the first time this runs, 10 is going to equal 10, so we're going to say countdown space and the value 10. So that's our first statement there. So we can comment this closing statement there. And now the next thing we want to do is say if the number is 0, print blast off. So we're going to say else if. And the reason I'm saying else if is because the last criteria here says for anything else, just print the number. So that's going to be our next piece of code that we write. So there's our else if, and then I'm actually just going to go ahead and put in an else, and I'm going to put in here a comment that says any other number, print the number to the paragraph. Alright, so if I is 10, we're going to say countdown 10. If get our criteria in here, condition. So otherwise, if I is exactly 0, this is our blast off thing. So we're going to say, put this comment in here. So if the number is 0, we want to print blast off. So I'm going to just borrow this paragraph text line. Let's say blast off. And I don't need to concatenate anything because there's no value to put in when it reaches 0. We could insert the I if we wanted to and say 0 dash blast off, but we'll keep it simple. So now this line is finished. And then in order to print any other number to the paragraph, what we'll do is we will say in the else statement here, I'll come back to that. So else opens, and then we want to make sure we close that because we're, actually I think that is the closing one. So the else logic is going to just print out the number. So we're just going to say para.text content equals I. So it's going to print words and the number 10. That's going to print 987654321, and then it's going to print blast off when it reaches 0. And so finally, the last component of this is to actually write that whole piece of logic, everything that we just appended to the paragraph. And so this output append child paragraph is what we would want to have happen there. And let's just double check our tags here. So I think we have let I equal 10 while the iteration is greater than or equal to 0. It's going to run all this stuff, and it's going to create a new paragraph. So it's going to create a paragraph, and then it's going to loop and say if it's this, do that. If it's this, do something else. And then it's going to output and append. So if we look at output is set to an empty div that has a class of output. So we're going to take that and we're going to append that whole thing with the paragraph code or content here. So the last thing I think we want to do is actually move the iterator inside the loop. I think we had that closed a little bit early. And so now what we should be able to do, and I'm going to copy this, I'm going to open a new browser and go into the console here. And we'll do a little bit of editing here. So I'm going to paste all this in. I'm going to remove selectively the comments so that we actually leave the real comments in place, but enable some of the code. Oops, not that one. And then before I run any of this, I'm actually going to copy some of these lines, and I'm going to, instead of doing para and text content, I'm just going to say console.log and have it log these out. And blast off. And any other number. So I am going to actually comment out the paragraph right elements, and on this one we'll just leave commented out for the time being and just see how this loop runs. So before I hit return, I want to copy all this out once, and then obviously I'm going to have something missing somewhere, so I want to make sure syntax error line 15. So let's look for missing parenthesis after an argument list. So it might be in one of my console logs here. So I have this extra string quote there. So I'm going to try one more time. Cannot set property inner of null 18. So let's just step through some of our variables. So interesting, it says I is not defined. Output is null, so I is not defined. Let's look at what else we could change here. So we actually probably don't need the let output stuff or the paragraph. So we really just want it to loop and output the values to the console. So we kind of stripped down our code here to just a basic loop. And we really could have just written the loop logic and then run it. All right. So we have success here. So we know at this point, at least our logic is right. We could safely go back to the exercise here and we can uncomment things out so that we don't go into an infinite loop. So that was the whole point of adding those console logging elements. And really, you could leave those in. You could add those here so you not only get output on the screen, but in the console. In what we're doing here, though, we wouldn't really see a console log. So hey, there we go. So let me see that pop up here in the live output. So countdown 10, 9 down to 1, and then blast off. So we spent a little bit of extra time just doing that pseudocode on this. We also did some testing in console log. So if this wasn't one of the exercises here with the live preview, console log would be a great option to include there. So that covers the launch countdown activity.